Hey there. Welcome back to the deep dive. You ever get that feeling like one tiny detail could totally change everything?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, today we're looking at a case that kind of proves that point, I guess you could say, a tiny amount of drugs and a few procedural missteps ended up impacting someone's freedom in a big way.
It's one of those stories that just reminds you how important details are, especially when someone's liberty is on the line. Like, it all comes down to these little things.
So we're diving deep into Antonio Jocson v. People, a 2019 Supreme Court decision that had everyone talking about police procedure and drug convictions.
Yeah, this case is pretty fascinating.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit.
Right.
We're dealing with GR No, 199644, decided on June 19, 2019.
Okay.
And the heart of this case is this guy, Antonio Jocson, who was accused of possessing a really tiny amount of shabu.
Yeah.
We're talking 0.05 grams, which is barely visible.
It all started with a tip that a certain Tony was selling drugs in Mandaluyong City.
Oh, really?
Initially, the police planned to just surveil Tony.
Just watch him.
Yeah, but then things took a bit of a turn. According to the official report, a chance encounter happened where Tony allegedly offered to share some shabu with an undercover officer and an informant.
So it sounds like a typical buy bust, but from what you're describing, it doesn't sound like it was completely planned.
Right. It kind of blurs the lines a bit, you know? Like, was this a planned operation or a spontaneous encounter? And that actually becomes a crucial detail later on.
Interesting.
So this encounter led to the seizure of a small sachet of shabu and Tony's arrest.
So then this is where things start to get interesting. The case hinges on the conflicting testimonies of the police officer, PO2 Molina, and Antonio Jocson.
Right.
PO2 Molina says he caught Jocson red-handed, but Jockson's claiming he was framed and even extorted by the police.
Yeah, it's one of those classic he said, she said situations.
Exactly.
Which often makes it really tough to determine the truth.
So when that happens, the evidence and the procedure become even more important.
Definitely. You need something solid to cut through the conflicting accounts.
So how did the lower courts navigate all this? Did they believe the police officer or Jocson?
Well, both the trial court and the Court of Appeals sided with the prosecution. They believed the police officer's testimony and upheld Jockson's conviction based on the presented evidence.
So at that point, it seems like a done deal.
Pretty much, yeah.
Like case closed, right?
Things were looking pretty bleak for Jocson at that stage, but then that's when things get really interesting. The case takes a huge turn.
Oh, wow.
The Supreme Court steps in and actually overturns the lower court's decisions.
Wow.
Ultimately acquitting Jocson.
That's a pretty dramatic reversal.
Yeah.
What made the Supreme Court change everything like that? Were they convinced that Jocson was innocent?
Well, the Supreme Court didn't exactly rule on Jockson's innocence. They focused on a very specific and crucial aspect of the case, the chain of custody of the evidence.
Okay.
Remember, in drug cases, it's absolutely crucial to prove that the drugs presented in court are the same ones confiscated from the accused.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You can't just bring any drugs into the courtroom and say, these are the ones.
Right. So the chain of custody.
Exactly. It sounds a little bit like a police procedural drama, but it's a super important legal concept.
Can you explain why it's so critical in a drug case? What does it actually mean?
Sure, think of it like a chain, literally. Each link represents a step in the process of handling the evidence from the moment it's seized to when it's presented in court.
Okay.
So each person who handles those drugs, every single one, needs to be accounted for. Their actions documented. The evidence needs to be carefully stored to prevent any tampering or substitution.
It's like a paper trail, but for physical evidence.
Exactly. And if even one link in that chain is broken or missing, it creates doubt about the integrity of the evidence, meaning it might not even be admissible in court.
Oh, wow. So it could potentially throw the whole case out the window.
Yeah, the stakes are pretty high when it comes to the chain of custody.
So in Jockson's case, the Supreme Court found problems with how the drugs were handled right. What exactly went wrong with that chain of custody?
Yeah, there were a few serious issues that the Supreme Court identified. For starters, the drugs weren't marked immediately at the scene of the arrest.
Oh, really?
Proper procedure dictates that officers should mark the evidence as soon as possible to avoid any confusion or potential for tampering.
Okay, so that seems like a pretty basic step. Did they at least make an inventory of what they took and take pictures?
Nope, they didn't do either of those things. No inventory and no photographs.
Wow.
These are really crucial steps for documenting what was seized, how much, and the condition of the evidence at the time of the arrest.
So that's already multiple violations.
Yeah.
Did PO2 Molina offer any explanations for why these things were missed?
He admitted during the trial that he knew the proper protocols but didn't follow them.
So he wasn't just clueless. He actively chose not to do it.
Yeah, and he didn't provide any solid reasons for these deviations from the standard procedures.
That seems kind of reckless, especially considering someone's freedom is on the line. But how did the Supreme Court tie these procedural missteps to Jocson's guilt or innocence?
Well, their logic was pretty clear. Each of these missteps cast doubt on whether the drugs presented in court were actually the ones taken from Jocson.
I see.
Without a clear and unbroken chain of custody, there's just no guarantee that the evidence hadn't been tampered with or even switched out.
So it's like a missing puzzle piece.
Yeah.
If you can't definitively link the evidence to the accused, the whole case falls apart.
Exactly. And there's actually another interesting detail here. Remember how PO2 Molina testified that he handed the drugs over to the investigating officer PO1 Del Mundo for marking?
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there was a problem with that handover as well.
There was a big problem. Actually, PO1 Del Mundo was never called to testify.
Seriously.
Yep. So there's no official record of what happened to the evidence while it was in his possession.
Wow, that's a huge gap in the chain of custody.
Exactly. We have no idea how he handled the evidence, who he gave it to, or even if it remained in the same condition. This missing testimony created another break in the chain, further weakening the prosecution's case.
It's crazy that something as simple as not calling a key witness could have such a big impact on a case. It's like a detective novel, where a crucial piece of evidence suddenly disappears.
It really is. The Supreme Court was super clear in its decision. A complete and verifiable chain of custody is absolutely essential in drug cases. Every single person who handles the evidence needs to be able to describe how and from whom they received it, where it was stored, and what happened to it while it was in their possession. This level of detail ensures there was no opportunity for tampering or substitution.
And in this case, that just wasn't there. It seems almost unbelievable that such seemingly small oversights could lead to overturning a conviction. But that's due process, right?
That's the power of due process. The Supreme Court, while acknowledging that a perfect chain of custody might not always be feasible in every situation, was very clear that the police need a really strong justification for any deviations from the established procedures.
And in Jocson's case, they didn't have that justification. They knew the rules, chose not to follow them, and ultimately that led to his acquittal.
Exactly. But it's important to note, this ruling doesn't mean that every single procedural error will automatically lead to an acquittal in a drug case. What it does mean is that the prosecution has the burden of demonstrating a clear and unbroken chain of custody to ensure the integrity of the evidence.
So this case is a win for due process, but it also highlights how important it is for law enforcement to handle evidence properly. Even small missteps can have a huge impact on someone's life. It's pretty sobering when you think about it.
Definitely. It emphasizes the weight of responsibility that comes with handling evidence in these kinds of cases.
It really makes you think about all those little details and how they can snowball into something much bigger. It affects the whole justice system.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here is that the Supreme Court acknowledged that a perfect chain of custody might not always be possible, especially in those fast-paced, unpredictable situations that law enforcement often find themselves in. But they made it crystal clear any deviations from those standard procedures have to be justified. And we're not talking about a flimsy excuse either. It has to be a rock-solid reason.
Right, because we're talking about someone's freedom here.
Exactly.
Their reputation, their whole life could be on the line based on the evidence presented.
Yeah, the stakes are incredibly high.
And in Jocson's case, those procedural lapses created enough doubt to justify his acquittal.
That's right. It wasn't about proving his innocence, but about recognizing the flaws in the process.
Exactly.
This case also underscores the importance of transparency and accountability within the justice system.
Right.
The requirement for witnesses to testify about every step in handling evidence isn't just some bureaucratic